Good evening. My name is Harold Mendelson, and this assignment is for Week 6 of History 701D02. And this discussion video is related to checking out various newspapers in the ProQuest database. My topic is the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which took place between June 19th and June 20th in 1944. The summer and fall of 1944 were a very busy time for the U.S. Navy in the Central Pacific. There were a number of campaigns going on. We had just landed in the Marianas, and that began in June 15th of that year, starting in Saipan. And by the time they were finished 2 months later, Tinian, Guam, and Roy had been liberated from the Japanese. On June 18th, it was the Battle of the Philippine Sea had begun. Quick run up to this. Japanese were deciding that they had one last shot at defeating the American forces landing at Saipan, and they realized the importance of this particular campaign because this would place the Japanese home islands within bombing range from the new B-29s. As a result, Japanese under Admiral Ozama had decided to put together a task force, and this task force was given the name of AGO. It was the first Japanese fleet, and it consisted of a number of aircraft carriers and associated support ships. There were over 400 aircraft involved, and they felt that they had superior means to attack American aircraft carriers because they had planes that had longer range, and they could send them off sooner, and they would be able to locate the American fleet before the American fleet was able to locate them. So on June 18th, they launched what amounted to 4 waves of Japanese aircraft to take off and attack the American fleet, which was the 5th Fleet, off the coast, the west coast of Mariana Islands. And what happened was they were picked up by American radar, and the commander of this was Admiral Spruance, and the tactical commander was Admiral Mitchell. Admiral Mitchell, as soon as he was aware of that planes were attacking, he had launched a full effort and went after these planes that were attacking. Well, by this time, the Americans had a much better aircraft than the Japanese Zero. They had the Hellcat, which was the F-6F, and it was much faster. It was much more robust airplane. It was better armored. It had very, very significant armament on it, and it was faster, could climb higher. The only advantage the Japanese had, they had longer range. Japanese planes got this longer range by sacrificing armor, so it was relatively easy to shoot down the Japanese aircraft. Majority of the Japanese pilots were new at this point in the war. There were maybe 20-25% were traditional old-style pilots who had full training. The rest of these were relatively new, and they didn't have the same experience, tactical experience, that the Americans had achieved over the first couple of years of the war. By now, we had been through almost 3 years. Well, it's actually 2.5 years. It's actually 3.5 years of combat, air combat in the Pacific, and these men were all very well trained. They had a lot of experience. The engagement was very, very intense. There were hundreds of airplanes in the air at the same time, and the Americans made a good account of themselves. On the first day, they knocked down over 325 aircraft at a loss of maybe 20. Some additional planes were lost because of mechanical problems as a result of combat, but the death toll was very, very low. There was 4 attacks come up. There were 4 waves. First wave came in and was met, and majority of these planes, only out of 125 or so of the aircraft, less than 30 managed to break off and return back to the carrier. Second wave was somewhat smaller, but not too much. They suffered even more damages. And the third wave had came in, and they again suffered high casualties. This amounted to, the first day loss here in this battle was roughly 375 aircraft. Now when the third wave left, and those that survived returned, they spotted the fourth wave coming in, and the fourth wave couldn't even find where the carriers were because they had been given incorrect coordinates. So some of the pilots turned around and led this fourth wave in, and they never actually were able to inflict any damage whatsoever on any of the Navy, U.S. Navy ships at that point. So by the time it was nightfall, all those groups of planes that could return had returned. A number of aircraft that were either shot down or suffered various damage and had to make water landings on the way back. About 3/4 of those people were located and brought back to the ships. The next day, it started out early in the morning, and what was going on is Admiral Mincher was sending out scouts to locate the Japanese fleet and finish them off. Up to this point, during the battle, 2 Japanese carriers were sunk, the Tahu and the Hayu. The Tahu was the most newest carrier in the Japanese Navy. It had an armored deck. It was much larger than the other carriers, and it was on its maiden voyage. But the crew was inexperienced, and it was spotted by a U.S. submarine that had been tracking it, and finally was able to get a legitimate shoot on the carrier, and fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. One of the Japanese pilots had taken off and had spotted one of the torpedoes in the water and literally crashed into it and killed himself and blew up the torpedo, which prevented it from hitting the Tahoe. But one torpedo did hit, and it ruptured the fuel tanks. The damage control parties were not well trained, and they made the mistake of turning on the vents systems to blow out all of the fumes from the leaking aviation and fuel. About 5 hours later, the fuel ignited from a spark, probably from one of the fans, and the carrier was totally destroyed. It sunk in about 20 minutes with a very high loss of life. Now, the person who was the admiral in charge of this, Admiral Ozawa, he was able to survive, and he was transferred over to a destroyer. But unfortunately, the destroyer did not have enough equipment for him to communicate with people he needed communicated, so he was transferred to another ship. So this is now the 20th. We had two carriers that were damaged by submarines. The third carrier, the Shikaku, had been, which was one of these 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, was located and sunk by American aircraft. In the first day of the battle, one pilot had taken off, and he was in an F-6F Hellcat, and unfortunately the ground crew, in a hurry to get him off, forgot to secure the folding wings down. They locked them down with bolts, and he was beginning to understand that because the wings were entirely too flexible. So you had to be very careful on his maneuvering, because it didn't have the same stress load capabilities it would have had if it had been locked down. He was flying along, and in a period of 8 minutes was able to shoot down 6 Japanese aircraft, most of which were what they called Judies, or these were dive bombers. Some of them were actually in the process of attacking ships with their in a diving motion, and this stopped. The next thing that happened the next day, all through the morning and the early afternoon, they were out trying to locate the Japanese fleet so they could engage them. And finally, around 4:30, it was located, and Michener had launched an all-out effort, realizing that the returning aircraft would be coming back at night, and they had very little experience at night landings. In fact, almost none. Plus the fact it was a moonless night, so that made it even more difficult. Well, they attacked and destroyed another carrier and a number of ships. They had there were oilers and destroyers and such. The result of that was they also shot down additional aircraft. As a direct result of this battle, at this point, the entire Japanese Navy had less than 100 naval aircraft left. This made them totally ineffective. The planes had to return back to the carrier, and Michener, who was very much appreciated, he was an admiral who was very inclined to support the men under him. When he realized that it was very dark and these planes were returning and they knew that they wouldn't be able to land on any aircraft carrier, he ordered all of the lights on for all of the carriers, the deck lighting, plus the lights on to the support ships, as well as sending star shells up into the air. So a majority of the airplanes that returned were able to land. Now there were a total of 80 aircraft that were damaged to the point that they either crashed during the landing or in addition to that ran out of fuel or was damaged to the point that they couldn't reach the carriers. 3/4 of those crew members were located and rescued. As a result, over 425 aircraft and 4 aircraft carriers were sunk by this battle. Michener was under the command of Admiral Spruance, who had overall command of the entire operation, whereas Michener had tactical command. And what he was having a problem with was when he knew where the Japanese were and he wanted to attack them first, but Spruance refused his request to leave. He had to stay behind because they were supporting the troops on Saipan, and that was their primary goal. Now this was not met very well with a number of the pilots and crew of the various ships, but in the end Admiral Spruance was correct in his choice. Some people were so aggravated they called him a coward, but that was not really at all involved in why he didn't choose. He would have loved to have gone after him, but his primary goal was to support the landings on the Marianas Islands. Well, at this point it was Saipan. As a result, the ships that survived were able to return and go back to Japan. The end of that was that from that point on, the Japanese Navy no longer had the ability to be an air offensive operation, which was extremely limited. I used the newspaper databases for reference, and they are included in the document that I will upload along with this. So I want to thank you, and looking forward to your discussions on this. Appreciate it. Have a good evening.